This is Glenn Robinson, President of the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. I would like to welcome you to our newest edition of Quick Takes on International Affairs. Please enjoy this talk and do consider joining the World Affairs Council.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending, I guess, when you're watching this. But my name is Sean Everton. I'm a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I've been invited by the World Affairs Council to present a short take on some of the work I do as a professor in the Defense Analysis Department. Before I get started, I want to thank the World Affairs Council for this invitation. It's an honor. I've seen emails, I've seen announcements of other presentations, and so to be included within that is quite the honor. So like I said, I teach at the Naval Postgraduate School, NPS for short, which you see there on the screen are covers from the 3 books I've published. I tend to, as they suggest, I focus on social networks, the study of social networks. The 2 on the left are concerned with dark networks, the one on the right with exploring the interplay of social networks with religious beliefs and practices. But here, right, I'm interested in dark networks, how we can use social network analysis to better understand them, perhaps disrupt them. So what are dark networks? They have been defined as covert and illegal networks. I like to think of this as less of an either or and more as a continuum, or really 2 continuums. Right, so we have here's sort of a graphic that sort of captures what I have in mind here is continuum running from illegal to legal and over to covert, and down there in the lower left we have pure dark networks, and in the upper right we have pure light networks, but in between we have a lot of gray, right? It's unclear whether some networks are light or dark or somewhere in between. I think a helpful way to think about a dark network is basically any group that's trying to stay hidden from authorities, and they will do this to a greater or lesser degree. Are they good or bad? You know, usually when people talk about dark networks, they're often consider them, you know, to be bad, to be something that needs to be disrupted, right? But really, it's kind of in the eyes of the beholder. So, like, consider this network, right? So this was a terrorist group operating in Canada that luckily never carried out a terrorist attack. They were rounded up by Canadian authorities, but I think most people would probably consider this group to be a bad dark network. But now consider this network here. This is an underground resistance movement that was operating in Warsaw, Poland during World War II, that was known as Chakota, right? From the perspective of the Nazis, they would be considered a dark network, but on this side of history, I think most people would consider them to be a good dark network. So it is kind of in the eyes of the beholder. Before I do some deep dives into some of the nuts and bolts of social network analysis, I want to begin with an example, a true story that had happened to one of our former students. He had taken a very early iteration of the dark networks course. And then after he graduated, he was deployed to northern Iraq, and he was looking at intelligence reports and maps of those intelligence reports. He says, you know, I can enter this data. It occurred to him he could enter this data into a social network analysis program and you know, perform some analysis on it, right? And one of the things he did was he identified some key actors within this network. He shared this information with his superiors. They took it and they ran what's known as a kinetic operation, a capture-kill operation, or what we might colloquially refer to as a whack-a-mole operation. It really had very little effect on the network. The network just sort of kept on going. It was like an ever-ready bunny. And so our former student sort of went back to their drawing board, sort of updated his data, and again, gave the information back to his superiors. But this time around, rather than running a kinetic operation, they decided to run a misinformation campaign. Their goal was to build mistrust within the network, essentially sever the ties between these key actors. They didn't have any direct ties to those individuals, but they knew people in the villages did. So they dropped misinformation into the villages, like through thumb drives or notebooks or what have you. And this misinformation eventually found its way back into the network. And true to form, these individuals started fighting with one another. And within a couple of months, the network had imploded, or the insurgency had imploded. And our former student was elevated to the SNA expert of northern Iraq. There's at least two takeaways from the story. There's probably more, but there's at least two. One is that there's multiple strategies that we can use to disrupt dark networks. One, often the first one is not always the right one. And he couldn't have done this without social network analysis. So that, leads us to the question, what is social network analysis? Well, this may come as a surprise, but it's actually been around for quite a while. Here is a social network graph from 1894. Here's one from 1938, right? Social network analysis is really developed out of a number of disciplines like anthropology and sociology and psychology. And as such, it's really best to see it as a collection of theories and methods, which assumes that the behavior of actors, and this can be individuals, it can be groups, it can be organizations, it can be nation states, that their behavior is affected not only by the ties to others, but by the networks in which they're embedded. So what do I mean by that? So if you look at this graph, you see two nodes there, nodes A and nodes B, right? Both of them have 4 ties. But node A is located at the center of the network and node B is located at the periphery. And that will also have an effect on their behavior, not just the people they have ties to, but where they're located within the network. So to give an example, if a deadly virus was passing through the network, A is much more likely to catch it than is B because he's at the center of the network. And then this in turn will have some sort of effect on his behavior and the choices that he makes. Social network analysis differs from other approaches. Other approaches tend to focus on actors' attributes like their gender, their race, their education. But attributes don't change across social contexts, so we can't use them to explain variation in behavior across these contexts, right? So here's an example from a book on social network analysis. It talks about this woman who at her job shows very little initiative, but when she shows up to the neighborhood association or the PTA meeting, she's this assertive leader. She's this dynamic leader. Her behavior has changed, but her attributes have not. So we can't use her attributes to explain her change in behavior. What has changed is her social context. And social network analysis is one way of capturing social context. It's not the only way, but it's a very good way. Anyway, that's why a lot of social network analysts will argue that interaction patterns may be more important for explaining behavior and understanding behavior than are people's attributes. Now, there's some misconceptions that people have about social network analysis. Some people confuse it with social media like Facebook, right, or Twitter. But these are social networking platforms, right? They're not social network analysis. It doesn't help, right, that Facebook, the movie about Facebook was called The Social Network, but they're not the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean we can't use the tools of social network analysis to analyze data from social media, right? So, for instance, a colleague of mine, we've been analyzing QAnon-related Twitter accounts. And here's a graph, 2 graphs. The one on the left graphs QAnon-related accounts prior to the shutdown of 70,000 accounts by Twitter back in July of 2020. And the one on the right shows a graph of QAnon-related accounts after those 70,000 accounts were shut down. There are similarities between the graphs, but there are also some differences. Another misconception is this contrast between networks and hierarchies. Some people, when they talk about networks, they have this in mind, these decentralized, informal, or organic types of organizations, while hierarchies are just the opposite. In the grand scheme of things, there's really not a right way or wrong way to use the term network, but at least in the world of social network analysis, everything is a network. Hierarchies and decentralized organizations. That's why we have measures of centralization to see how hierarchical these networks are. So to quickly summarize what social network analysis is, entails, right? It's a collection of theories and methods that prioritizes relations over attributes when we're trying to explain and understand behavior. It's grounded in systematic empirical data. Traditionally, we have recorded this data in matrices, right? So here, you see actor number 1 has a tie to actors 3, 4, 5, and 6. Matrices are not the most efficient way to record data. With small networks, it doesn't matter. With larger networks, it does. So there are alternative ways to do this, to record these data. But there's sort of an intuitive appeal to these matrices, or at least to some folks. We use a lot of visualizations. This is the Norton Top terrorist network. 79 individuals, 10 different types of ties. We can't draw this on our own, which is why we have algorithms that can do it for us. Thank goodness. All of this really is quite computer intensive. That's why we need software. Even though social network analysis has been around for a very, very long time, it's really just taken off in the last 30, 40 years with the advent of the computer and in particular, the advent of the personal computer. So when we're examining dark networks, what do we focus on, right? One thing that we look at is the overall structure of the network, its topography. Networks can be centralized, they can be decentralized, they can be dense, they can be sparse, they can be large, they can be small. And their topography, their structure should inform the strategies that we craft for disrupting them. For example, a centralized network is vulnerable in ways that a decentralized network is not, and vice versa, right? So here's some examples of different networks. The Dakota network I talked about a little bit earlier. Here's Watergate. Here's the Jewish Underground. These guys are trying to blow up the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. 9/11 bombers plus their support network, Norton Top terrorist network, Syrian resistance network, Mexican drug cartel network that was coded by some of our students, a wannabe ISIS cell in Minnesota, and some jihadi networks in Europe. As you can see, they vary in size and density and how centralized they are. Something else that we're interested in is whether or not we can detect subclusters or subnetworks in these larger networks. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. But if we can, this might inform the strategies that we're crafting. Again, we might be able to, insert misinformation within the network that will get them fighting with one another, at loggerheads with one another, such that the network can implode on itself without us having to do anything else. And then ultimately, we are also interested in identifying key actors within the networks. Central actors are in positions of power. And if they are able to leverage that power, they can control the flow of material and non-material goods through a network. Of course, what we do with that information will vary, just as we saw in that first, that example that I began the presentation with. There's a number of different centrality algorithms. I'm going to just sort of illustrate a few here. The size of the node varied there, sort of reflecting how central those actors were. As you noticed, there's quite a lot of differences going on there. That's because our centrality algorithms have different assumptions about what constitutes a central actor. I showed you 4, there's hundreds. In fact, one person has actually created a periodic table of centrality algorithms that he continually updates. When we're thinking about centrality, we need to be careful because there's a bias to focus on the center of the network. I showed you this graph just a little bit ago, the Syrian resistance network. The first article that we wrote about this, we focused on these 3 clusters. They're right in the center of the graph. I didn't even have to draw circles around them probably for your eyes to be drawn to them. Interestingly, though, we probably should have been focusing on these clusters up here. These two clusters split off from this network, joined ISIS, and helped ISIS establish itself in Syria back in 2012 and 2013. So I'm coming to the end of my quick take here, but I want to emphasize that social network analysis for exploring and disrupting dark networks, it's not a silver bullet. It can't solve everything. It's just one tool in the toolkit. But I would say that it is a very, very useful tool. So in closing, I just want to say thank you to the World Affairs Council for giving me this opportunity to share what I do. Hopefully at some point, I'll get to meet some of you on the other side of the pandemic. Until then, take care. And again, thank you once again.